So recently, Star Trek Strange New Worlds had a crossover with Star Trek Lower Decks, and the crossover event got me thinking about other crossovers in the Star Trek universe, and those other crossovers got me thinking about one of the most interesting and maybe even perplexing stories in the Gospels and about the Bible as a whole. Trust me, there is a connection between the Star Trek and the Bible stuff, although maybe a weak one. I'm Ben Avery. This is Strangers and Aliens. Let's make some weak connections. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me as I get to talk about two things in my life that I enjoy. Now, one of the things that makes weak connections weak is because it's connecting two things that one is fairly vital and important in life, and the other one is important, but only in the sense that it brings some pleasure and brings some joy, but it's not life-saving and it's not eternity-changing. So you're making a connection between something that is eternity-changing and something that is a diversion here on Earth. But like I said, watching Star Trek got me thinking about something, and it got me thinking about something from the Gospels, which, the Gospel is all four of the Gospels together. They are a story, the story of the life of Christ. And Strangers and Aliens is about that connection between creativity and Christianity and story and God's story, and so there's so many things. C.S. Lewis talked about how, all these different mythologies and religions, they all have these little snippets of the big story, the important story, the story of God and his love for humanity. As I was watching Star Trek, I saw something that got me thinking about something, and I wanted to talk about that something with you. So, Star Trek is probably my favorite fandom. If someone were to push me into a chair and tie me down, I would probably, if I was pressed into it, I would probably go with Star Trek. Now I know, actually, if you're looking on the screen here, Star Wars, and then there's one more up there that you can't see. But Star Trek, first of all, Star Trek engaged my imagination through TV and books and comics and gaming. And it also created some social situations for me that developed into lifelong friendships. I've talked about those before on the podcast, and I'm not going to get into that now, but it's just been a big part of my life, and it's been a big part of friendships and relationships like that. And it engages me in a different way than Star Wars. So of course, because of that, I have been watching all the new Star Trek that's been coming out, all of it. Lower Decks did a crossover episode with Strange New Worlds, and it brought these animated characters, two of them, into the live action world. And fortunately, the actors who voice the characters look close enough to be able to do it, to make it work. And so the episode itself, it was fine, if a little bit gimmicky. Because of that episode and the crossover guest starring things that they were doing with that, it got me thinking about guest stars from other different series appearing on other series of Star Trek, and why they appear on these other episodes of series, not just episodes, these other series of Star Trek. There's the first big crossover character, which is the first episode of a new series without which you couldn't even have done a crossover, because if it was just continuing the Star Trek, the original series, that's not a crossover. That's just the thing itself. But you have Star Trek Next Generation, first episode, Encounter at Farpoint. There's a scene that meant absolutely nothing to the plot. It didn't do anything to serve the plot at all, other than one of the things that this 2-hour episode was doing was introducing the entire cast of this new crew of the Starship Enterprise. And so in some ways, I guess this kind of fit into that. But even then, this scene could have been taken out. No one would have even known it was missing. No one would have even cared. It wouldn't have caused any of the story beats to hit wrong or anything like that, because it's just Data walking with Dr. McCoy down a hallway talking about the Enterprise and mentioning Vulcans. and looking to see if Data had pointy ears. But it meant a lot. While it meant very little to the plot, it meant a lot to Trekkies because you had Dr. McCoy show up in Star Trek The Next Generation as if to say, this is the same universe. This is the same continuity. And it matters. But he was welcoming the new cast, and that new cast was embodied by Data. He was welcoming them to the universe of Trek. And then you have Captain Picard himself showing up in the first episode of Deep Space Nine to launch a new series, Deep Space Nine. Picard comes up basically to say, this is same continuity, same universe. In fact, it's happening at the same time as my show over there, but I'm going to come onto this show. I'm going to have some drama with Sisko because I was Locutus of Borg, and when I was Locutus of Borg, I did some awful things that resulted in Sisko losing his wife. By the end of the episode, you kind of have them they've worked through the drama, and then Picard said, okay, I think you're good. I'm going to leave you here. I'm going to go back to my show, and you stay here with your show and have a good time with your show. And then another episode of Next Generation had another classic crew member. You have Scotty showing up to the Next Generation in an episode that promised something amazing as far as science fiction ideas go, the Dyson Sphere. A Dyson Sphere is so big that the shell of this thing would be the same as an orbit for a planet. Where do you get the materials to create something like this? They didn't explore any of that, of course. They didn't explore the civilization that could have built the thing, or maybe could there have been a civilization inside the thing? They didn't talk about any of that. It ended up just being about accepting older people as people who have value. LaForge had to accept that Scotty does have some value. He's not just some old fogey from the olden days. So another episode that they did, Spock showed up for a two-parter that was meant to get us excited about Star Trek VI. The one little mention of something that happened in Star Trek VI that they talked about, it was barely meaningful, but it got us talking about the new movie. And of course, it was fun to see him in action. And then, of course, there was Generations, where you have Kirk showing up there to pass the big screen baton. So McCoy was there to pass on the small screen baton, and McCoy was there to say, okay, you can have your TV show. We're going to be doing movies over here. And now that the movies were done for the original series cast, this was Kirk. And I mean, Scotty and Chekhov also showed up, and so did Cameron from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. He showed up to hand it off. But it was really Kirk handing it off to Picard, saying, You have the movies now, and these movies are continuing on from our movies. And then even one more step beyond that is Leonard Nimoy showing up as old Spock in the Star Trek 2009 movie. Again, serving that purpose of saying, hey, it's not the same as what we've seen before, but that's okay. It's a continuation of what you've seen before. There are a lot more examples I didn't mention, but I haven't gotten to the weak connection yet, so I need to move on and not talk about those. Anyway, in all these examples, the idea is to give weight and importance to the new cast and to the new show. So thinking about all these then got me thinking about the weak connection I want to talk about, which is where in the Bible something similar to this happened, which is old people showing up to give weight to the connection of an existing story. And I told you, it's a weak connection, but it is a connection. So Matthew 17 says this. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and his brother John and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. He was transfigured in front of them, and his face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light. Suddenly, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with them. Then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. I will set up 3 shelters here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down and were terrified. Jesus came up, touched them, and said, Get up. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus alone. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, Don't tell anyone about the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. So the disciples asked him, Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Elijah is coming and will restore everything, he replied. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they didn't recognize him. On the contrary, they did whatever they pleased to him. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he had spoken to them about John the Baptist. Reading that story, it just always stuck with me. It clearly had a significant meaning, but what was it? That was the thing. I just couldn't quite grasp what it meant. And I never actually heard a sermon or read anything about it, but every once in a while I'd think about it and just know there's some sort of clear, deep meaning that I'm just not catching. I mean, God says, there's definitely significance in God saying, "This is my son, listen to him." Okay, that's obviously significant. The other thing that happens, though, is it becomes one of those scriptures that the doctrine of the Trinity hangs on, because as God speaks of Jesus and to the disciples, he speaks of Jesus as his son. And then, of course, earlier in the account in the Gospels, the baptism of Jesus one-ups this with the Father saying, "Jesus is his son, with whom I'm well pleased," and then the Spirit coming down like a dove. You got the full Trinity right there. All three parts of the Trinity are represented in that one scene. One of the things I was trying to think through and always trying to imagine was just what it meant when Jesus was transfigured and he became bright white like the light. It's kind of a reversal of what happened to Moses, where with Moses, he witnesses and sees the glory of God and he shines because of that. And people can't look at him. But then with Jesus, he causes his clothing to shine. He causes his clothing to become like light. With Moses, it's coming from the outside at him, and with Jesus, it's coming from the inside out. Again, because this is God. It's God the Son. Then there's the whole thing with Moses and Elijah showing up. This is the weak connection, and this is where, Lower Decks got me thinking about a story from the Gospels, okay? There's so much going on here, and this is where I'm kind of with Peter. He sees these two people talking to Jesus, and they're talking about stuff that he doesn't understand. And in one of the accounts from the Gospels, it says they're talking about his upcoming death. This is a fascinating moment that just features these two important people from their history. Moses, the one who brought the law and penned most of the Pentateuch, the one who was leading the people during the time that probably most defined them in all of history, that time when they had the Exodus and they left Egypt and they crossed the Red Sea and they wandered in the wilderness, who brought the law to the people from the mountain. And then you have Elijah, the prophet, who is the big prophet, the one that when other prophets show up, they have the spirit of Elijah. And that's where Jesus was talking about John the Baptist. But also Elisha was another one. And he never died. He was taken up into heaven in a chariot of fire. And so what you have here is you have the law and the prophets, and they are represented and interacting with Jesus, who was the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And they're there to speak to him about his death, which was the action that he was going to go through that will become a vital, important part of that fulfillment. And in some ways, these guys showing up here were like Dr. McCoy walking the halls of the Enterprise with Mr. Data. For Star Trek, it was really just a reminder to us geeks that the new show matters. For Peter, James, and John, it was a reminder that Jesus was not just a man. Peter says then he wants to make tents. He wants to create shrines to honor the prophets. And this is where God speaks, and God says, "This is my son. Listen to him." And there's an element of these men, lending credibility and credence to what Jesus is about to do, what he's been saying. But there's also this thing that's so much bigger, where God is saying, yeah, these guys are great, but this is my son. Listen to him. This moment is a physical expression that Jesus, the Christ, as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, is so much more than just the great rabbi, the great teacher. So, yes, the image of favorite actors showing up in a new show is a weak one, but this small earthy thing does illustrate this one big, huge spiritual thing. The artwork that I used when I was reading this comes from issue number 6 of the Christ, which is that's a turning point in a lot of the stories that are showing up in this point in his ministry are moments when the disciples are kind of looking at each other like, what is this all about? What is this all about? I can't help but let my imagination run. I wish I would have had 24 issues of the Christ so I could have expanded more on these things. But in my mind, when I'm thinking about the story, my imagination just goes to these places where you have this momentous moment in history and it's witnessed by these guys and they barely understand what's going on. And then the other thing is, I'm just so curious, like, what were they overhearing? They heard enough to overhear him talking about his death with Moses and Elijah, which they barely even understood after it happened. And so what were they thinking when they're hearing him talk about these things with Elijah and with Moses? And then there's just this idea of Moses and Elijah, like, what were they thinking when they're kind of plucked out of, whatever the afterlife is meant to be during that point in time? And that's one thing that, I've studied a lot of different viewpoints on what happens after you die and, all these different things, but they're plucked out of it. And it just reminds me of the song by Carmen. I can't remember what the song is, but it might be called Lazarus Come Forth. I can't remember now, but it's just a story song telling the story of Lazarus dying, going into the afterlife, talking to all these guys about what was going on when, the experiences that they had as they were experiencing him in the Old Testament. So what were they thinking when they got pulled out of that and just dropped down to talk with Jesus, and in some ways, this was their opportunity to see that the Old Testament, which they were a part of, and the things that they were a part of, this was the fulfillment of that. And how cool is that to think about these guys who, both considered prophets, but Moses representing that law and Moses just having time with God where he actually spoke to God and in a way that other people just never had a chance to. And Elijah, who made prophecies about what was going to come, what was going to happen, and he gets to see it's happening. It's happening. But again, you have the Old Testament, which is original series, and you have New Testament, the next generation, and here they are, the big crossover with these stars, from our earlier series here. But there's just so much going on, just so much packed into this one moment in time. As big as this is, as important as this is, I can't help but feel that I just need to let the final word go to God here. Okay. And I feel like the thing that we need to think about the most in this moment actually comes from God. It's almost as if God says, this is what I want you to get out of this moment. So I'm just going to repeat that, where God says, this is my son, listen to him. That's the reminder. This is my son. Listen to him. Don't be distracted by the other stuff. The other stuff is important, but you've got to pull your focus here, because everything in the Old Testament is pointing to here, pointing to him. And then everything in the New Testament is pointing back at Christ. And beyond the New Testament, everything is pointing back to Christ, where it's just that fulcrum point moment in time where everything before was leading in and everything after is pointing back. Those are my thoughts. So I want to thank you for spending time with me to explore my weak connections and hopefully some strong applications. If you liked what you heard, please hit like, hit subscribe, or subscribe to the podcast. You can find us at strangersandaliens.com. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/strangersandaliens. And of course, youtube.com/strangersandaliens. Until next time, I just want to say again, thank you so much for listening, and Godspeed.